Hello and welcome to the pharmaphorum podcast. I'm your host, Jonah Comstock. More than 10,000 rare diseases are attributable to a single irregular gene, but each of these diseases only impacts a handful of patients, and the research and development to cure these diseases can cost millions of dollars. So the typical ways of funding disease research can often fall short. My guests today, Drs. Zach and Geri Landman, are physicians, founders of the new nonprofit Moonshots for Unicorns, and the parents of Lucy, a little girl who suffers from one of these single-gene rare diseases, PGAP3-CDG. They're here to tell me their story. So, welcome to the show, Zach and Geri.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Jonah. Nice to be here.
So, in the world of rare disease, obviously, it faces certain challenges that other more broad diseases don't have, where it can be difficult to fund development for treatment and have the economies of scale make sense for pharma. And that's sort of where this story starts from a trend perspective. But tell me a little bit about where it starts from a personal perspective and just give us the basics, and then we can dive in with a little bit of a Q&A.
Well, 4 months ago, our daughter, who was 10 months old at the time, we thought we had a normal child, that she occasionally was looking a little off from her normal neurodevelopmental milestones. When she would get a cold, she would be slightly more floppy and not making as good eye contact. But we had so many tests and studies. I was at Stanford as a physician, and Geri's a pediatrician, and we had literally had so many MRIs and spinal taps and nerve conduction studies, and everything was reassuring. And so not until April 18th did we get our genetic tests results back from our neurologist, and we learned that Lucy unfortunately was born with 2 bad copies of her PGAP3 gene, which is a gene in the umbrella of GPI anchor disorders. Basically, it produces a protein which helps molecules stick to the outside of the cellular membrane and is very important to neurodevelopment. It's a gene that is actually so important that it's been preserved throughout evolution that, even yeast and earthworms have it.
Oh, wow. And so what's the practical effect on Lucy's life?
We were shocked when we got the diagnosis because on the spectrum of PGAP3 and other GPI anchor disorders, Lucy is relatively mild. She was a little bit floppier than average babies, but very social, always smiley, and was making progress along her motor milestones, sitting unassisted. And it was really just how poorly she looked whenever she got sick that made us do the genetic testing. And so we and her neurologist were shocked about the diagnosis because it is such a severe disease. On April 18th, her neurologist told us that Lucy was likely to have severe intellectual disability, that she would probably lack expressive speech, as all kids with PGAP3 in the world do. She may never walk and would be ataxic and hypotonic throughout her life. And that there was a strong likelihood that she'd develop refractory seizures during childhood.
And based on the doctor's review of the literature, as she had never had a patient with PGAP3 before, even at Stanford, there were no treatments or therapies, and no even research into any potential treatments or therapies or clinical trials anywhere in the world.
So that's where this idea, this Moonshots for Unicorns, comes in, right? Because it's not a case of a disease that people have been trying to find a treatment or a therapy for and failing. It's just a disease where there just hasn't been enough, there haven't been enough people afflicted with it for them to really put the effort into looking in the first place.
Yeah.
Correct. This gene was only recognized to cause human pathology in something like 2014. So 1, it's relatively new. 2, there's estimated to be maybe 30 to 50 cases diagnosed in the world just on different case series. yeah, I mean, Moonshots for Unicorns. So everyone knows what a moonshot is, right? It's a lofty attempt to get to the moon. And even if you shoot for the moon, you land among the stars. And a unicorn is inspired by Lucy and all the other rare disease kids out there that, she's been special from day one. We really wanted a third baby to complete our family. And she was different from her sisters from the first moment. And I think that's how a lot of rare disease families feel, is that their child might be very different, but is incredibly special and magical.
Mm.
And we just wanted, um, with Moonshots for Unicorns, it took a couple weeks after the diagnosis to come to this, but we wanted no family to ever feel like we felt that first night going to bed thinking there's no treatments and no cures, and no possibilities and no hope. And we hope that Moonshots for Unicorns, starting with PGAP3, but extending beyond that, will give hopes to parents and families of kids with single gene disorders throughout the world.
So how does it work? It's crowdfunding, right? To actually fund research.
Well, exactly. And so after we were truly devastated and mourned for about a week after learning of Lucy's genetic diagnosis, as physicians, and we happened to be lucky enough to train at UCSF and Harvard, and I was at Stanford, that we basically emailed the first and last author of every researcher who had published on PGAP3, as well as the leading researchers on the latest advancements in therapies such as gene therapy, ASO technology, as well as drug repurposing. And that search led, actually, that based on the science, there are uh, likely and probable treatments for PGAP3. They just haven't been explored yet. Uh, for instance, um, uh, a drug had recently been found, a repurposed drug, which was a Japanese nerve medication, to be highly effective at boosting a similar protein on an upstream pathway as Lucy's. And so this little girl named Maggie, she had similar expected symptoms as Lucy, that she was unable to walk and lacked most expressive speech, as well as quite ataxic. And after a few months on this repurposed therapy, she was walking unassisted, coloring in the lines, and making really just astounding progress. And so, with that experience and based on that data, actually the drug is now fast tracked in a combined phase 1/3 study at Mayo Clinic from an individual family's work on finding repurposed medicines.
Wow.
To get to your question about crowdfunding, yeah, I think this has become the model for rare disease families that, we are certainly not the first patient advocate organization out there to try to raise money for research for a cure for their child. There have been many super successful examples. Smashmart, I could list a bunch, and I'm so thankful to the families that we've been connected to since getting this diagnosis, who've already paved a pathway in this way. Many of those organizations focus on a single gene, um, which makes perfect sense to us, and not to say that we're not going to start with PGAP3, because certainly that's the inspiration for all of this. But yeah, I think the trouble with diseases that have less than 50 kids in the world is it's hard to find a scalable market, right? Pharmaceutical companies don't have a lot of motivation to do all the R&D that it takes to get to these therapies. Gene therapy in particular is quite expensive. We're talking between $3 and $7 million for development of a gene therapy for an individual gene, just to get it to a phase 1 FDA trial. And there's lots of barriers to gene therapy trials, to the FDA being probably number 1, 2, and 3, that, it's just expensive to do the kind of testing that's necessary to get through the FDA.
And even to do a human trial with so few patients available, you sort of have to
Exactly.
bend the rules.
Yes, totally. But that's not to say that people don't care, right? I think what we've discovered since April 18th is not only are our scientists and researchers so generous with their time. We've sent hundreds of emails that we expected to go into the ether and never get a response. And people overnight have written back to us with thoughtful, lengthy, brilliant responses that have allowed us to move this forward. Um, and then just the generosity of strangers too. It amazes me how many people care about Lucy, and I think that's really true for um, a lot of parents and families and individuals out there who could easily envision themselves in the same boat, and care a lot about our unicorns.
So, what is the next step? How is this going to work to expanding out? Well, first of all, obviously, trying to do as much as you can with PGAP3, but then as you said, you want it to be bigger than just one gene.
I mean, I think the field of gene therapy in general, the mission of Moonshots for Unicorns is to cure single gene disorders, and I think as of now in science, gene therapy is probably the best way that we have in the scientific community, and the closest that we have to a cure for those things. Um, it's complicated, right? And I would love to say that this is an entirely plug and play model. You take a virus, you put the fixed gene back into it, you give the virus to the baby, and the gene starts working. And if it were that simple, I think things would be a lot further along than they are. But there are complexities that we have learned a ton about in the last 4 months. That said, the more genes that go through this process, the better the process will become in terms of figuring out the nuances of the virus and figuring out how you can modify the gene to make it best expressed. And probably most importantly, the more genes that go through this process, the more used to it the FDA will become. And therefore, when the FDA approves, a certain dose or a certain vector, or a certain modification to the gene, and they've seen it enough times that they feel confident that it's safe or worth a risk benefit ratio, then the price of this all will come down considerably, and the process will become a lot more automated, and it will be a little bit more plug and play. And so that's the big picture, long picture goal is, let's do PGAP3. That's going to take 2 years, probably at a minimum. The GPI anchor disorder pathway has something like 16 genes in it, and all of them needed gene therapy. They fit pretty well inside the vector. That's one of the challenges with gene therapy is your gene actually has to fit in the virus. And so moving along to the next one and the next one, we're not going to stop once Lucy has a treatment. We've been in this boat for a short time, but we know what it feels like, and we want to be there for other families as well.
So, I mean, first of all, if I didn't say it already, I'm obviously so sorry to hear what's happened. But I'm also just really impressed that you have reacted to that situation, by really, taking these steps to come together, create something, and try to make a change for yourselves, but also for everyone else who's in this position. And I'm just curious, like, do you think it's because you're both doctors that you were able to sort of take those steps and jump into that research, or yeah, I mean, I know a lot of parents probably wouldn't have responded in the way that you did, and so I'm just interested to hear kind of why you think.
Yeah, over the past 4 months, we've met so many inspiring and wonderful families, and you know, every parent becomes a true PhD and expert in their child's disorder. And sometimes it takes, months, and sometimes it takes years, especially if you don't have much of a scientific or medical background. For Geri and me, with our medical background, especially with Geri being a pediatrician, we could understand the science and the biochemistry and the physiology pretty quickly. And so we didn't sleep for a few days, and we then could feel like we had a pretty good grasp of where the deficiency was, what the current research said that the deficiency in PGAP3 did in different cells, and how we would potentially approach it from, a pharmacology or biochemistry perspective. So I think that part shorten that period to a matter of days, where it's months or years for other families. But probably other aspects that are as important as our types of personalities. And so, I'm the type of guy that when I wanted to first, run a marathon in medical school, I, actually didn't stop in a marathon and just went straight to a 100-mile race. And I've only done one triathlon, but I made it an Ironman. And so I'm kind of a person that is going to take it to the extreme. And so about a week after Lucy's diagnosis, I looked at Geri. I said, look, we can lay in this bed and cry and just be sad for the rest of our lives, or we can do something. And let's not just cure PGAP3. Let's think bigger and start with PGAP3, and then replicate this process time and again, so no parents ever have to go to bed thinking that they basically have no option other than to watch their child metaphorically drown in front of them, as how we feel that Lucy will be without a treatment.
So you talked about the science and the ways in which sort of it's what is available and what steps need to be taken. But of course, the other piece is the funding. As you said, these are very expensive R&D efforts. So how are you approaching that? Is it just from individuals? Are you working with the pharmas? Are you approaching foundations? And how do you get up to the money that you need to really make this happen?
Yeah, we're open to all ideas. We're well on our way, which is great. Um, Certainly, some of it is personally funded because we just couldn't wait for some of that. So Zach and I have spent a down payment for a house, and our family has been caring and generous with Lucy as well. There are some pathways for this. Other organizations have used social media very effectively to raise money and crowdfund. Smashmart being one of them. Thank goodness for the availability of Facebook and Instagram and everything, because it allows us to reach people who we never would have been able to reach before. Foundations are also an excellent source for funding for research like this, though the challenge with that is, one, just the competition among them because there aren't very many grants, and two is the timeline. PGAP3 isn't inherently neurodegenerative. There are many neurodegenerative single gene disorders out there that time is truly of the essence, but we're trying to capture, normal neurodevelopmental critical periods here. So time is really important to us. Um, Organizations like CZI's, the Chan Zuckerberg Institute, that have these wonderful grants really post RFAs like every 2 years. I can't wait for the next 2 year cycle to come up to do this research. I just don't have that kind of time. And Lucy doesn't have that kind of time. Um, and so that's a challenge. And the NIH is similar. What a wonderful organization that wants to fund rare disease research, that we're talking about a like 3 year approval time, once you have some base research going. And a lot of these places want to see that you've done probably about $500,000 worth of research already by the time they're willing to kind of fund anything. So wonderful organizations and great grants, but a challenge from a time perspective and from an initial investment perspective. Then there are pharma companies that have charitable arms that we're so grateful to. Amgen has a wonderful charitable arm. I think Genentech funds slightly different things. They're not really in the rare disease space, but they have money available to apply to, and so that's really wonderful when pharmaceutical companies can kind of take some of the profits that they've made from more profitable drugs and put this toward this. And then in the end, particularly for slightly more common diseases, like in the realm of maybe 500 people, pharmaceutical companies will often look at sort of the initial research, license the product, and then take it to clinical trial. The worst thing that can happen is when a pharmaceutical company takes, the research that's been funded by family foundations, that has already been done, that maybe got a gene therapy proof of concept done, license it, and then sit on it and do nothing with it. That's the most devastating thing. that money has been invested. There are kids waiting for a treatment, and it's sitting in an IP locker, basically.
Because there isn't a profit motive. Yeah.
There isn't a profit motive, exactly. But yeah, those are the sorts of things that we're doing. Um, and there's always local efforts too. We live in a wonderful community here in the Bay Area. People have been very generous, and certainly reaching out locally to people who know your family and care about it, and trying to access the PGAP3 or your genes community at large for crowdfunding that way is helpful as well.
Well, hopefully we'll include a link in the show notes if anyone's listening and knows someone or feels moved to help.
Thank you.
So
Thank you so much.
we're coming to the end of our time. I just want to let you guys tell me what we haven't talked about yet that you think is important to discuss.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really challenging, and we've heard this time and time again from multiple pharmacological CEOs and venture capital funds, is you need at least 1,000, maybe 500, but at least 1,000 patients for us to be interested in anything that you're doing. Because, like you said, you need to ultimately develop a profit. Well, the problem is that people don't test for conditions that often don't have treatments. And so, what we've seen time and time again when gene therapy has hit the market, a condition will have, a couple hundred patients, and it was done entirely by a family, foundation. And then overnight, once the therapy is potentially available, that number triples. And we're seeing, 600, 700 patients. And so we've actually been working with the wonderful folks at Invitae, who are the genetic testing company, to help us understand kind of the true prevalence of these diseases. And so the literature would say that there's about 30 to 50 patients worldwide with PGAP3. Well, if you look at the database, and they've kind of run some machine learning models, and it's still very rare, but probably closer on the order of like 1 in a million or 1 in 1.5 million. And if you kind of do the math in the United States, that puts it right in the order of around 500 to 600. And so if we had 500 to 600 patients for PGAP3 just sitting there waiting for a treatment, the opportunities and the potential, interest from investors and from pharma companies would be much greater. But there's not going to be that if we don't have a treatment. So it's a chicken and the egg problem. And so it falls on organizations like Moonshots for Unicorns to do the hard nitty gritty work of raising money through a nonprofit model, doing the hard work, developing the treatment, knowing there may or may not be sufficient market size. And that's the type of work that Moonshots will have to do. And we're working with our industry partners to expand the ability for patients to get genetic testing, because the scope is very limited, and the insurance coverage has been really challenging both on the private and public side. And so we are huge advocates for genetic testing being very early in the diagnostic process, especially for categories of conditions like pediatric epilepsy and neurodevelopmental aspects, which oftentimes have a strong genetic component. You probably don't need an admission, 2 lumbar punctures, a nerve conduction study, 2 brain MRIs, all of which Lucy had, and all of which were reassuring and pretty much normal before swabbing a cheek to get a genetic diagnosis.
Wow. Yeah. So that's so interesting in so many ways. Just that, what you said about there, potentially being 10 times as many patients. And then I assume if you were to include like the developing world, even more, right? Globally.
Absolutely. And so much of it is that even when we got our diagnosis, or Lucy got her diagnosis, one of her mutations was actually classified as unknown, what's called a VUS, a variant of unknown significance, because there wasn't enough data. Well, it turns out a 6-year-old in New Zealand has the exact same mutation, missense mutation. And when our doctor reported back to Invitae that Lucy did in fact have symptoms consistent with PGAP3, and that New Zealand patient also had symptoms of PGAP3 with that same mutation, only then could they reclassify that mutation as pathogenic, because now you have two patients, with it. And so that's the law of numbers, that there's, I think, only about 16 known pathogenic variants of PGAP3, and 10 or 100 times more of these unknown, variants. And so without testing and without having patients that the symptoms and the reporting back, you will never know the kind of true prevalence of the condition. And that's not just true for PGAP3, that's true for every single, genetic disorder out there, especially the rare and ultra rare ones.
Right. So the takeaway is that rare diseases are not quite as rare as they seem on the surface. And the other thing I hear often about rare diseases is that while individual rare diseases are rare diseases are not rare. That many people, I can't remember the exact numbers. And what you were saying about there being sort of a class of genes that as you develop gene therapy on more and more of them, it becomes more almost plug and play. That's a really interesting piece too, and a source of hope that this could be kind of solved at scale, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Our vision is that over time, and with the work of Moonshots for unicorns and similar organizations, we make treatments like gene therapy to be like the flu shot, where the transport vessel, the plasmid, the promoter that kind of upregulates the gene in the cell, those are off the shelf. And it's the same, used pretty much every year, and the FDA feels very comfortable. And so you switch out the cargo, you do some very standard safety, toxicity, efficacy studies in mice, and then you can jump straight to the clinical trial. You're not bogged down in changing requirements on each one, multiple rounds of non-human primate studies or other large animal studies, which add considerable time and cost and complexity to each condition. And so our hope is that through this work is that we, show, okay, PGAP3 works. Okay, PIG-A works. Okay, we don't go down this pathway, and that you're saying, okay, each loss of function, mutation along this pathway pretty much follows the same biomechanics, right? You're making the same thing at the end of the day. You're getting a lipid raft to the cellular membrane. And if you're using the same stuff every time, you don't have to, reinvent the wheel and pour $7 million. Maybe it's $500,000 or $250,000 or something like that, where a pharma company says, this makes sense, and I'm not just looking at PGAP3. I'm looking at the pathway. I'm looking at a 16 enzyme pathway, and I can see that if I put the work in for PGAP3, I can recreate the same process in a standardized fashion, and create a spectrum of effective treatments.
So really, we're talking about precision medicine here, and it seems like you're probably, when it comes to the regulatory piece, you have allies in this fight, right? There's other people in pharma that want to see these processes streamlined in the same way to reflect sort of where we are with the technology, right?
We would love, and the answer is we don't have any partners right now. If people are listening and want to partner with us, we feel very strong about this on the advocacy side. We know that we had excellent care at Stanford. We absolutely love our doctors, and nobody did anything wrong on the diagnostic pathway in terms of doing all those tests before the genetic diagnosis, in terms of an admission and all those invasive procedures. And the reality is you have to do those because in order to justify sending out 480 genes to get a genetic diagnosis, you have to say that you failed X, Y, and Z. And so that's on the testing component. And then the same thing is on the treatment perspective. Having an effective gene therapy that no patient can afford and is not covered by insurance also does nobody any good either. And so, Geri mentioned the kind of hoarding and stockpiling some of these treatments. And I don't think it's because there's bad people or bad actors out there. I think it's because if you put the time and money to manufacture and produce these therapies and there's not insurance coverage, you've just spent all this time, and you're not going to be able to have a sustainable business model with it. And so the whole system needs to change in terms of training doctors to move the genetic testing up in the diagnosis. That's going to require the coverage on the insurance side. And then once you do have the accurate test and you develop the therapies, you need to have patients then that can actually afford and get them into the patients that really need them.
Well, thank you both so much for joining me today, for sharing your story. I know it's not the easiest thing to talk about, but it's very inspiring what you guys are doing, and I really wish you the best of luck in with Lucy and with the whole company and the whole project.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jonah. We really appreciate it.
That concludes this episode of the pharmaphorum podcast. You can find more information about this episode, including a download link and information about other installments in the series, at pharmaphorum.com/podcast. The pharmaphorum podcast is also available on iTunes, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, and Podme, where you can find and subscribe by searching for pharmaphorum. And don't forget to visit our website, where you can sign up for daily news and analysis bulletins, and to follow us on Twitter at pharmaphorum. Thanks for listening.